I think there's like some interesting papers that are starting to come out about how there's this kind of collapse that happens for large language models when large language model output is fed back into large language models. And so I think it's almost going to be like there was like the data sets pre large language models could be incredibly valuable rather than the ones that are post large language models that are just like non-human synthesized data sets.
Wow. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like I'd heard a story about how like there's a certain type of steel before a certain era that was like really valuable because it didn't have all of the pollutants in it.
So yeah, it's actually, so what's happening right now, it's actually there's an international incident going on between Malaysia and China, which is probably what you're referring to, and the British, because the Chinese have started salvaging the wrecks of the British Asiatic fleet that was sunk in the Battle of I think the Battle of Java Sea in World War II, which are protected under international law as military graveyards. But the Chinese are pulling them up because the steel used in those battleships was forged before the first atom bomb test.
That's it.
And apparently, if you want to build scientific instruments that measure things like quarks and things like this that are used in things like the Large Hadron Collider and stuff like this, you have to use steel that was forged before the first atom bomb test, because and this is such a freaky thing. Every piece of steel that was forged since then has traces of radioactive elements in it. And by the way, so do we. This is something that this was a little bit less shocking to me because I was an anthropology major, and I was shocked about this same thing back in 1989 when our professor introduced us to the concept that you didn't have to go to the trouble of radiocarbon dating human bones if you were just trying to determine whether this was a murder scene or an archaeological scene, because there's a quick test you can do. Anyone who was born after 1945 has different bone chemistry than anyone who was born before 1945, because we all have little shiny bits of atom bombs in us.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I think this issue that we're talking about, right, is like it's going to be interesting because there's another paper I just read recently that was talking about kind of like the limits of this data as well, right? So they had postulated that like the limits of high quality language data will be exhausted by 2027. Now there's a huge margin of error that they have in these graphs. You should go read the paper. And they think about like the amount of kind of video and imagery data as well being exhausted in the next couple decades. This doesn't take into account, say, personal data, right? Which includes a bunch of other kind of like issues around privacy. And then it brings into another topic, which is kind of called federated learning, where you end up having learning at the device that you're actually using. But there's a lot of interesting kind of topics that come out of this idea of like, how does synthetic or synthesized data by these like large language models to then train smaller models? How does that either help us or hurt us? And does it amplify biases that we don't want, like biases that cause us to have worse accuracy for like the true outcomes we want?